Hi, this is Eric Vanman, an associate professor in psychology and neuroscience at the University of Queensland. In January, I posted a video here about the books that I read in 2022. It turned out that I had read a lot of books in 2022 and I didn't really have a chance to talk about all of them. So in that video, I promised that I would more regularly give updates about the books that I'm reading so I don't have this massive list at the end of the year to talk about. So today I'm going to talk about 5 books that I read in January of this year, in 2023. And 4 of them are fiction, 1 of them is nonfiction. I generally tend to like books that have sort of a psychological bent to them. I really like to read about the inner states of somebody when the characters are interacting with each other. Not too much into, big action kinds of novels or even romances for that matter. First book on my list was a book by Graham Greene. Now, Graham Greene is one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, and I have never read any of Graham Greene's works before. There's many novels I could have picked, and I decided to pick this one, Travels with My Aunt, because it had been recommended to me by my wife, in fact, who had heard about it on a radio show, that it's a very funny sort of book, sort of light. It's really fascinating. It was written in the late 1960s about a bank manager who's now retired. I think he's in his 50s, and he is going to start traveling with his aunt, who has a very eccentric style. She takes him on a train journey on the Orient Express, which turns out to me not as glamorous as you might think it was. He gets to Turkey. There's all sorts of weird things that are happening with his aunt, very mysterious circumstances behind her connection to him. I just found the whole thing just utterly enjoyable. Very, very fun. It's got a lot of really good jokes in it. It has interesting characters. The aunt is just really amazing herself, the things that she says. She's had this amazing life that she talks about. I don't know, it felt really modern, like it has sort of a modern feel to it in terms of the humor and the topics that get discussed. Yet it also feels sort of classic. It feels like the kind of older style that we don't get much of these days. And I just really, really enjoyed the writing, and it made me want to read more Graham Greene. Now, in fact, in a couple books from now, I'll tell you that I did read another Graham Greene novel, and it wasn't as fun as Travels with My Aunt. So definitely consider, if you want to read Graham Greene for the first time, or maybe you've read other Graham Greenes, consider Travels with My Aunt. It's just a really fun read. Now, the next book that I read was something that I had noticed on Goodreads was the Book of the Year in 2022. I hadn't heard much about it. I think I'd seen the title here and there, but hadn't really thought about reading it, didn't know anybody who had read the book. It's called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. And it's a really fascinating story about 2 friends that have known each other since they were quite young, Sam and Sadie. And Sam and Sadie met each other on a hospital ward when Sam was recovering from a really bad car accident, and Sadie was there to visit her sister who was getting treated for cancer. And the 2 of them, Sam and Sadie, become friends over playing video games in the late 80s. So in the 1980s, you hear a lot of references to the kind of video games that people would have been playing then. And then their friendship continues to go on through school and so on. But then there's sort of a lull in their friendship, and they don't see each other for a while until they meet up again. And the 2 of them reunite their friendship when they happen to run into each other in Harvard Square at the Cambridge Tea Stop. And so they're at the Harvard Cambridge Tea Stop, and she, I think, is at MIT and he's at Harvard. I can't remember which one's which. Anyway, their friendship blossoms again, and it's over these video games that they played before, these computer games. And so they start writing a computer game together, and they do very well. They market it, turns into a company. They have another friend who joins along with them, and the 3 of them start this big, cool computer game company. And you start to follow their success over the next couple decades. Now, what's really interesting here is that, I used to play computer games back in the 80s and 90s, and I did love some of the games that they mentioned, but I was never really a hardcore gamer or anything like that. So you might think that if you don't play computer games, you might not find this very interesting. But the author has done a brilliant job of really showcasing how game development is very artistic, that there's a story behind it, there's all sorts of thinking about the artwork and how the players interact as they move around in their worlds and so on. And it's just really a fascinating behind the scenes kind of story about how computer games like this are just this really cool new art form. On top of that, you've got this friendship between these two people that goes through so many trials and tribulations. It all seems so very realistic. You might think that there really is such a game company after you finished reading this book. I just really like this book. It was just something I was smitten with and wanted to keep reading it faster and faster as I went through the book. Really anxious to find out how it was all going to end in the end. So think about that book. It's a really good one. I think it'll open up your eyes. You'll find something I think that you can relate to, no matter who you are. Now, the third piece of fiction that I read in January was The End of the Affair by Graham Greene. Now, I'll have to admit to you that I had seen the movie The End of the Affair, I guess it was like 20 years ago, starred Julianne Moore. And it's funny is that I remember going to that movie and I'm not even sure that I finished it because I got sort of bored with the movie and left. I just had this sort of negative feeling about the movie. And when I was looking through and trying to figure out which Graham Greene novel I wanted to read next after I had read The Travels of My Aunt, I thought, how about reading this one? Because I read some reviews that said it's nothing like the movie. The book is so much better than the movie. So I picked it up and started reading it. And I have to say, I was disappointed. It's about just as bad as the movie was, in the sense that it's just this really melodramatic story about these two people who have to end their affair when circumstances happen. It's during World War II when they've started up this affair. And then they just sort of go 4 years without seeing each other, and then they run into each other again, and they sort of think like they're going to start up the affair. But in the end, it's just a romance. They just don't ever end up getting together again. And the protagonist, the main narrator of the story, he's just this sort of whingy, whiny character that I just didn't like very much. He seems to treat his lover, his woman, with not a whole lot of respect. I just couldn't understand why this book, of all of the Graham Greene books, is something that a lot of people talk about as one of their favorites. I just didn't get it. And so before I ruin it for you and say anything else that if you're somebody who is thinking about reading Graham Greene, maybe somebody else out there will actually like this book, or you've read it and liked it, but I just didn't like it, and so I can't recommend it to myself to anybody. All right, the fourth book on my list, I will admit to you right now, is one of my favorite books of all time. It's got to probably be up there in my top 10. Yes, I read a book just a few weeks ago that blew my mind. That was a fantastic book, and it came out 30 years ago. And for 30 years, I've seen this title on the shelves, and for some silly reason, thought it was a book of nonfiction. So I never thought about picking it up, never read it when I was thinking about reading a novel. It came out in 1992 or 1993, and the author is about the same age as me. She went to university around the same time as me. Her name is Donna Tartt, and it's called The Secret History. Fantastic, absolute classic novel of our times. It's about a group of people who go off to a small college in Vermont, and while they're there, they bond so closely together around a really very strange teacher of classics, teaches classes about Greek language and literature and so on. But it's just the six of them. They're the only six that are in the class, and they take all of their classes with them pretty much, and they become incredibly close, and the connections between them are so close that it gets out of control, and there's some bad things that happen. And in fact, the book starts with a murder of one of these students. And so though most of the book, you're trying to figure out who was this person that got murdered and what happened? Why did he get murdered? And I can kind of tell you that the basic progression of the book is that you spend the first half of the novel sort of finding out how that murder took place. It's just introduced to you in page 1. And then for the second half of the book, you deal more with the consequences of the murder. It's just brilliantly written. I found every word, every sentence that Donna Tartt writes is just fantastic. I just couldn't believe how good this was. In fact, I think it took her 7, 8, 9 years to write this novel, and it really pays off. It's just such a well-written, intense book. Now, what's interesting is that very little action takes place on the pages. It's very psychological, so you really get into the minds of the different characters and the ramifications of the actions that take place at different points in the book. Another thing you should know about this book is that it's inspired this whole aesthetic called dark academia. And you can find more about Dark Academia in the link below. There's a couple good videos about it. But the idea behind Dark Academia is that it's sort of a way of dressing that reflects sort of the way college kids or intellectuals might dress, like the characters in this book. People in Dark Academia tend to like reading books a lot. They tend to write in notebooks rather than using computers. They use typewriters. They probably listen to LPs or records rather than digital recordings. Anyway, the Dark Academia thing, they almost always talk about The Secret History as their main inspiration for it. So again, if you think back to when this book came out, 92 or 93, it's really about people going to college in their early 80s. It's a time when there's no internet. And one of the things that kind of strikes you about this story is how much the characters do things without being able to text each other or send email messages or anything like that. And I went through this time period and I'm just amazed that how did we ever coordinate anything? How did we actually have meetings? How did I know to find you at the library at 7 o'clock? Well, we made arrangements and we saw each other there and we left messages on answer machines, I guess. I don't even think I had an answer machine to think about it. But anyway, it was a bit of a time travel for me and I enjoyed it for that reason. But again, the writing, superb. So if you haven't read it yet, think about it. Read The Secret History. All right, I have one more book that I want to recommend. And it's a very specific kind of book to read, but it's a book of nonfiction, okay? You can see here, it's The Art and Business of Online Reading, How to Beat the Game of Capturing and Keeping Attention by Nicholas Cole, okay? Now, this book is written by a guy who apparently his main way of writing is to write for Quora, the website where you ask questions and people make answers and write answers. I didn't realize it, but you can really have a profitable writing career on Quora, giving really good answers to different kinds of questions. And he is one of the top Quora contributors. He also writes for Medium and other online places. And what he does is he, in a very succinct style, gives you advice about how to write for things online. But I think that his advice actually works for all sorts of writing, whether it's going to be online or not. That is, how do you capture a reader's attention? How do you think about what the title is? How do you catch a person in the first couple sentences? That's the kind of the art of that he's talking about here. It's sort of maybe akin to what you find in journalism. How do I get the reader to want to read this story? It's really, really good. It's full of really useful tips about how to write in different formats, how to write an article that's like a to-do list kind of article or a top 10 article or an article about just your opinions on something. I just found a lot of really good advice in this book that I could use for my academic writing, for the way I teach, for the way I might even talk about things here on YouTube. So it's a good book for just overall writing, whether you're doing it for online or not, that I recommend. And I'm really glad that I read it. You can see I've got a bunch of little tabs here of things that I'm going to come back to later on. All right, so those are my 5 books that I read in January. I've already read a couple more since the end of January, including another really good book that I'll talk about in my next video. But for now, I hope that you're reading along and, we can talk more about books again in a few weeks. So thanks for watching.